Human like you, man. That is our title this evening. We're going to be getting into some apologetics. No, that is not learning to apologize, though some of us married men could probably use a lesson on that. So just real quick, we're going to cover a lot of information in a short period of time. So I believe this would be an enlightening Bible study for you or your friends or even your children if you want to just jot some notes. I'm sure nobody would mind if you wrote a couple notes on a card. So that being said, let's just get into it. Apologetics are reasoned arguments or writings in justification of something, typically a theory or a religious doctrine. So my main reason, and this is my point kind of here at the beginning, kind of weird, but my main reason for bringing this topic to you is that I've been convinced that when we are building our faith, it is imperative that we have tangible facts. That is, facts that prove the reliability of the Bible and that Jesus was just as human as you and I. There has been controversy surrounding Jesus and the Bible ever since we first read about him being planted in Mary's womb before she was married. But how do we know that a virgin named Mary actually gave birth to Jesus? How can we be assured and in turn assure others that Jesus was in fact a real person? That he walked on this earth and did the things that are recorded in the New Testament? How can we be sure that the New Testament is even an accurate and reliable account of Jesus and the things that he said and he did? Lots of questions. I'd like to look into some of the evidences that we have available to us today. These evidences will help us to be certain that Jesus was indeed a real person and that the New Testament is a reliable form, an accurate form of historical text. I believe this kind of information is necessary so that we can be ready and that we can have our children ready or whomever we are teaching ready when we have to defend our faith. So first, we need to understand the facts. There is a major difference between how one feels and the cold, hard facts. Just because someone may feel a certain way about something doesn't make it true or false. Only hard evidence can determine what is true and what is false. It is a very dangerous thing to build an argument on a foundation of feelings. Therefore, it is imperative for us to look at the facts that we have at our disposal to determine by the facts that Jesus actually walked this earth, performed miracles, and that the New Testament is truly an account of his good news. So that being said, Christianity is a historical religion. How do we know anything about the Civil War or Gutenberg's printing press? History, of course. People who were there to record the events, and we have in turn been able to trust that they are reliable because they were present. They're called eyewitnesses. If you're like my wife, she loves crime shows. Eyewitnesses are the most important. They give the best testimonies. The Bible is written on eyewitness accounts. So Christianity is grounded on events that took place in actual history that is recorded by eyewitnesses or people like Luke who sought out eyewitnesses. Christianity exists in well-written documents that we all know as the New Testament. These documents have passed the most strenuous tests for historical accuracy and authenticity. Christianity does not deal in mythology. It is based on a historical founder and eyewitness accounts. We can read in Luke 1 through 4. And I have that up on the screen. But inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who have from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, having delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Despite what some believe, the New Testament is indeed a historically accurate collection of writings. As stated before, they are written from eyewitness accounts, and Luke states to most excellent Theophilus in Luke 1 through 4 here, that he was writing the events as they happened in an orderly fashion. That he used eyewitness accounts so that Theophilus would know that what Luke was writing to him was accurate and could be trusted as the truth. In the same way, we can then read this and trust it as the truth. In the same way, proof of Jesus and his death are found in secular writings that are outside of biblical texts. And this is where we start getting into the proofs of the claims that I've made. I'd like to mention to you 5 Gentile writers that have been found and used to confirm Jesus outside of the Bible. The first one is Thallus. He's a historian that Julius Africanus mentions in his histories when he talks about the darkness surrounding Christ's death. Thallus, the historian, his conclusion of the darkness after Jesus died was that an eclipse had occurred. We're not going to get into that argument, but what we can gather from that tiny bit of information is that Thallus takes for granted Jesus' existence and his death. Second, we have Marabar Serapion, a man who is writing to his son, illustrating the foolishness of persecuting wise men such as Socrates, Pythagoras, and Christ. A manuscript is actually preserved in the British Museum. Thirdly, we have a Cornelius Tacitus, one of the greatest historians of Rome. He writes of the Christians being made scapegoats for the great fire of 64 AD. He writes, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of our procreators, Pontius Pilatus. Fourth, we have Plinius Secundus, also known as Pliny the Younger. He's the governor of Bithynia, and he wrote this to Emperor Trajan. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang an anthem to Christ as God and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to commit any wicked deed, after which it was their custom to separate and then meet again to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. And then fifth, we have Suetonius, and he was an annalist and court official of the imperial house of Hadrian. And he writes of the Jews being expelled from Rome because so many of them were turning to Christianity because of Christ. As we can see, these 5 names here are not the names of men who are mentioned in the Bible to have been with Jesus or his disciples, but it is because of the actual events that took place surrounding a real-life Jesus Christ of Nazareth that these writers knew and wrote of him and the things that happened to him. As well as those 5 Gentile writers, I'd like to bring to you 2 Jewish sources. And they are as follows. The Talmud. It was written between 70 and 200 AD. It contains 2 different books put together, but it is the central text of rabbinic Judaism. It contains 80 references to Jesus, and all of them are hostile. And then second, we have Flavius Josephus. Most people have heard this name. He was a former Jewish general turned historian. He calls Jesus the so-called Christ. He recorded James' arrest and trial, calling him brother of Jesus, and says Jesus was a doer of great deeds and states he is the founder of the Christians. Now, I'm not making this up. This is on documents. We have this. I'd like to read to you a reasoning about a particular writing that Josephus wrote when referencing Christ as James' brother. I found it very interesting. I hope you guys do too. And we'll read this here. Many men named James are mentioned in Josephus' work, so Josephus needed to specify which one he meant. The common custom of simply giving the father's name such as James, son of Joseph, would not work here, because James' father's name was also very common. Therefore, Josephus identified this James by his reference to his famous brother, Jesus. But James' brother Jesus also had a very common name. Josephus mentions at least 12 other men named Jesus. Therefore, Josephus specified which Jesus he was referring to by adding the phrase, who is called Messiah, or since he was writing in Greek, Christos. This phrase was necessary to identify clearly first Jesus, and via Jesus, James, who was the subject of the discussion. This extraneous reference to Jesus would have made no sense if Jesus had not been a real person. So as we can see from just the Jewish references, it's hard to draw a conclusion that allows us to believe that the New Testament is unreliable and that Jesus never existed. Thirdly, I'd like us to know that Jesus existed because of his resurrection. You see, an entire society was satisfied with Jesus being dead on the cross. They buried him in a tomb. And that's how dead he was. They buried him. 3 days later, he was gone, resurrected just as he'd been saying that he would be. So how does this resurrection prove that he existed? By reasoning, no feelings, but by reasoning, Matt Perman writes of what's called three truths in his articles, Historical Evidence for the Resurrection. And I found this extremely interesting again, and I'd like to share it with you. So number one is, the tomb in which Jesus was buried was discovered empty by a group of women on the Sunday following the crucifixion. Second, Jesus' disciples had real experiences with one whom they believed was the risen Christ. And third, as a result of the preaching of these disciples, which had the resurrection at its center, the Christian church was established and grew. He continues on to state here that based upon these three truths, we need not even assume that the New Testament is inspired by God, that the three truths are so strong they are accepted by serious historians of all stripes. When presented with just this evidence and these references, we can only come to a conclusion that Jesus indeed was a living, breathing person in history. So as we are continuing to look into and research Jesus as a real person in history, we need to find out the validity of the Bible. It's necessary to do that because we have very limited information on Jesus from non-Christian sources. Everything we know concerning his personality comes from the New Testament. His teaching is not found in any detail outside of New Testament writings. Ed Wharton writes that there is neither a historian nor a theologian nor a gospel preacher that can say with any authority whatever that Jesus did anything or that Jesus said anything happened to him without an appeal to the New Testament as the historical source book of that statement. A way we know that we can rely on New Testament writings are their integrity. For that, we need to look at manuscripts, which are copies of the originals. We have around 5,000 Greek New Testaments in whole or part available to us today. Now, these are copies that are not just reproduced word for word, but letter for letter. When evaluating the validity of these copies, we need to know we are getting the same information that was written on the originals. For this, we need only to look at the time in history which they were copied. There's a process called manuscript attestation. It is the method used for determining the accuracy of the classical histories, which I might add are generally received as authentic. So how does the New Testament hold up against the classical histories? I'd like to share a few examples with you guys. These are not all of them. Again, that's where some research comes in on your part. But I'd like to share these with you. So the New Testament, we have the Codex Sinaiticus, if I pronounce that correctly. I've been working on it all week. So it was copied around 350 AD. It has the entire Bible in it as well as other books. It is removed from copy date from the originals by about 250 years. We have next the Codex Alexandrinus, copied around the middle of the 5th century AD, removed from originals by about 350 years. And then thirdly, we have Codex Bezae, copied in 5th or 6th century AD, and it's removed from the originals by about 400 years. So let's look at classical histories. Let's compare these dates. We have, firstly, Caesar's Gallic Wars, written about 50 to 58 BC. The oldest manuscript is from around the 9th century AD, so it's removed from the originals by about 800 years. We have the Annals of Tacitus, written about 100 AD. The best copy that we have is from the 11th century, and it's removed from the originals by about 900 to 1,000 years. And then thirdly, we have the History of Herodotus, written about 480 to 425 BC. The earliest of these are dated around 900 AD. They're removed from the originals by about 1,300 years. Now, the classical histories are considered, authentic. So, as we can see, the New Testament copies we have in our possession carry much more validity in the case of them being documented from the originals correctly, because they are copied in time closer. They are copied in time closer in time to the originals. Did that make sense? I hope so. When we look at the time the New Testament was copied, as well as how many copies we have, we can know for certain that the New Testament is just as or more accurate than the classical histories. How can one not come to that conclusion? I'm not sure. When applied to the same test as the classical histories, we can be assured that the New Testament, in the words of Ed Wharton, that we are reading is 99 and 44 100ths an accurate representation of the original documents. That should give us peace. In brief mentioning, archaeology has also made a contribution in proving the validity of the New Testament writings. There are over 200 years' worth of archaeological research, and there has been no contradictions concerning what the Bible says and what archaeologists have found. I'd like to share a snippet out of an article. Again, something I found interesting I'd like to share with you. John D. Curid says this in his article titled 10 Crucial Archaeological Discoveries Related to the Bible. That's all one title. It's a mouthful. All right. Perhaps the greatest contribution of this find is to our understanding of the transmission of the biblical text. It is encouraging to note that the differences are minimal between the Old Testament texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls and various editions of the Hebrew text produced 1,000 years later and used today, involving the smallest textual details. The meaning of the text itself is not affected by these differences. Again, that is a reason to give us peace. So in conclusion, there are many evidences that prove Jesus lived as a man on this earth. And I encourage you to dig into the hard evidences that we have available to us. It's one thing to have your faith. People can argue your faith with you. But it's another to have factual evidence that you can put in their hand and say, go argue that. So this is the whole point of my lesson here. Jesus was a real person in history that is just as human as we are today. We know that through the New Testament, which has been proven to us to be historically accurate. If in the New Testament, Jesus claims to be God in flesh, Jesus, in fact, is God in flesh. When the New Testament says he gave blind men sight, blind men indeed received their sight. We can trust that when Jesus was resurrected, seen by his disciples, ascended up to heaven, and all of that information is reported to us through the New Testament, that is fact and not myth. Again, I really hope you guys take time to go research. It's done a lot for me in my studying. So as we end here tonight, I hope that you have found this information useful. And if you need to begin to study or need prayers from the congregation or elders, whatever it may be, please grab somebody that maybe you're comfortable with. If you don't feel comfortable coming down forward, I get it. But grab somebody, Your eternal soul is too important to just forget about because you don't feel comfortable. Grab somebody you're comfortable with. Or if you'd like to be baptized, please come forward tonight as we stand and as we sing our invitation song.